the Eco-Modernist Society of North America. I'm here because we are in the midst of a potentially monumental ecological crisis. It is only through a new environmentalism 2.0 that progress can be made. We believe that our only hope for human advancement and even human survival is through the exponential advance of science in the service of humanity. We stand firmly against the war on science that is predicated on the appeal to nature fallacy, which is the belief that whatever is natural must be good and whatever is unnatural must be bad. This belief has become an impediment to advances in areas such as human health, social progress, and even environmental progress. In the field of medicine, the appeal to nature fallacy has already led to catastrophic outcomes. Resistance to vaccines threatens public health and the lives of children. The unwarranted resistance to GMOs has not only held back the fight against climate change, but it has also hampered our ability to feed the developing world as well. Campaigns against GMOs have also held back efforts to ward off the deadly Aedes aegypti mosquito, which has killed countless millions as a carrier of disease and plagues. The scientific consensus concerning the safety of GMOs is solidly supported in every major scientific organization across the planet. The only thing green about being anti-GMO is the extra cash that is made by overcharging for expensive boutique food. But that won't cut it when it comes to raising crops with accelerating heat stress, droughts, floods, disease, and insect infestations brought on by a hotter planet. It makes no sense to accept the call of the IPCC for decarbonization within the next 12 years and yet reject their conclusion that these goals are impossible without nuclear power, which has proven itself to be the cleanest, safest, and most reliable way of achieving decarbonization. It is the most reliable way to decarbonize simply because the alternatives of weather-dependent power sources are inherently unreliable. And nuclear is the cleanest energy source because it is the only form of energy production that completely encases its waste stream. Super safe, advanced Generation 4 reactors, which will almost completely convert existing nuclear waste to centuries worth of energy, are coming very close to commercialization. In fact, it goes completely against most everything we're led to believe, but nuclear is legitimately the safest form of energy generation according to all the accepted worldwide energy fatality data. But there is one thing that nuclear is not safe for, and that is the fossil fuel industry. The fact of the matter is that the fossil fuel industry has a long history of funding the anti-nuclear movement, along with climate change deniers, to protect their bottom line. Solid science is in dire need of a champion. And that is what eco-modernism is all about. Eco-modernism is a new environmental paradigm which looks to reverse the fear of nuclear power and scientific progress in general. Ecology-based modernism is the most direct way to define it. Eco-modernism as a philosophy is described in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. We believe humanity should not be rejecting technological progress, but rather separate our impacts from nature through the responsible use of technology and urbanization. Urbanization is an unstoppable worldwide trend and the best solution to many environmental problems. It offers sustainable development for the human population and is a historic antidote to both deforestation and species extinction as humans move away from using wildlife as their protein source. Vertical, urban, high-rise architecture minimizes the use of land, resources, and energy, enabling walkable cities that facilitates the more efficient use of mass public transit as well. It must be emphasized that our support for technological solutions is definitely not about defending industrial polluters, nor do we accept funding from corporations or industry. Nor does our defense of technology imply that we just need to sit back and let things take care of themselves. To the contrary, we believe that humanity is at a crossroads that severely threatens our future on this planet. We reject the idea of resource limits on many levels. The advance of science has a long history of getting around problems of resource scarcity and will continue to do so. Another reason is that Earth is just one of a multitude of worlds available to explore in our solar system and beyond. comets, and asteroids are untapped reservoirs for raw materials. If we could find a way to thrive in artificial ecosystems off-world, we could use what we learn to help sustain terrestrial ecosystems here on Earth. I hope by now you understand the worthiness of our cause. Ecomodernism is really only a philosophy at this time. I want to talk to you about the necessity of turning it into a movement, which will be part of the larger environmentalist movement. For it is only through our presence and participation that there can be any hope of moving environmentalism in the right direction. Our aim is not to divide the environmental movement, but rather to multiply its numbers with the incorporation of many scientific and educational communities that is working to both build chapters of eco-modernist societies and support our growth worldwide. We aspire to increase our numbers by bringing together the numerous supporters of climate action that have been alienated by mainstream environmentalism's wildly contradictory support for the shutting down of nuclear power plants in the midst of a climate emergency, and welcome them into our ranks. Thank you.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, EcoModern channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, EcoModern Society of North America.
Tell you something about this world I see. Let me tell you something, brother, about you and me. There's no such a thing called freedom, just a word they say. Freedom is in heaven, that's where it stays. Freedom, just a word they say. Freedom, just a word they say. Let me tell you something about this world I see. 2020 vision. Let me tell you something, brother, about you and me. There's no such a thing called freedom, just a word they say. Freedom lives in heaven, that's where it stays. that's where it stays.
Hello and welcome to the program. This is the Eco-Modernist Channel Live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm here with Gabe Ignetti and our special guest, Matt Huber. Matt is a professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at Syracuse University. His work focuses on the relationship between energy, capitalism, and the politics of climate change. He's the author of Lifeblood, Oil, Freedom, and the Forces of Capital, and Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet. He's a regular contributor to Jacobin Magazine. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, we're in just a slight different scenario today. Gabe is out in Hawaii, so if his audio cuts out, I'm going to be a little more aggressive on you're not coming in. But I hope everyone out there is doing great. We're live on all our channels, and we're ready to get started. So, welcome to the program, Matt.
Thanks. Yeah.
You've written extensively about the climate crisis, and just a lot of people are more doomer, a lot of people are more optimistic. What's your take? What level are you at, and what are our prospects moving forward?
Well, I vacillate between kind of doomerism and optimism. But I have the book Climate Change as Class War basically says doesn't really matter what our feelings are on the climate crisis. Really, it's a question of power, and it's a power struggle. And I argue it's a class struggle, which I mean class in the sense that it's really going to have to be sort of a mass movement that can wrestle control over our energy production system to direct it in the rapid decarbonization we know needs to happen, and that particularly the climate movement has not really shown for its existence that it has that level of social power to really take control over large scale energy infrastructure systems and direct them. So the book is really trying to get us to think about how we could imagine a much more powerful climate movement. And but stepping back from that, I think the barriers to solving climate change are rooted in the capitalist kind of system, and there's kind of layers to that. But the main argument of the book is that ultimately, again, because capitalism is really, one of the definitions of capitalism is private ownership of production for profit, and that's just sort of a general way in which we organize a capitalist system. We have these sort of scattered private owners of businesses, and they compete on markets for profits. And it's quite complicated globally, but a large part of the energy sector is owned, particularly the fossil fuel sector, is owned by private owners, and therefore, and a lot of private industrial actors, high emitting industrial actors, are private owners, and they have very short-term interests, and they have very kind of narrow interest in just profit and accumulation growth. And therefore, it's really going to take, again, a mass kind of movement to wrestle control away from those private actors. There's other problems, which is, I think, fundamentally, decarbonization is going to require a whole lot of investment in public infrastructure that capital and capitalists are not known for really being that interested in. There's a reason why we had government build things like sewage treatment plants and the interstate highway system, and many there's these kind of shared infrastructures that build these infrastructures that everyone sort of needs, that underlie society. And because we've kind of like taken the electricity system and highly deregulated it and broken it up into all these different parts and subjected it to all this competition, but now it's so fragmented, it's not clear. There's no sort of clear plan for capitalists to invest at the scale we need of sort of totally restructuring these systems, and not just for the grid, but we're going to need new public transit systems. We're going to need public housing, totally restructuring of kind of the infrastructures of everyday life, and that's going to require a lot of investment that capital is not willing to provide. Typically, it's provided by the state, but we've been living through this kind of austerity period where we sort of, the state has sort of taken gone away from its role as sort of providing that kind of public sector investment for public goods. And so we're kind of in this impasse where people like the Biden administration think, if we just throw a bunch of tax credits out there, we're going to incentivize private capital to build this world historical transitions away from fossil fuels. But I'm very skeptical that that's going to take place. The last thing I'd say is capitalism is known for subjecting much of economic allocation to what Marx and Engels called kind of the anarchy of markets. So this sort of anarchic markets, which are really the opposite of planning, right? And I think also for decarbonization and for, again, public infrastructure like the grid, it's so clear that we need, and I think a lot of like central planning, we need a lot of like coordination and planning of this infrastructure. And because that's just a few reasons why capitalism's kind of needs to do for climate change.
Right. And I mean, we see it all the time now with private enterprises. They're getting very, very interested in energy development because their grid connections are not quite what they wanted. And so all these major producers, they're looking to nuclear or other baseload sources of energy, and they're forming these off-grid partnerships, these out of government control, out of government oversight partnerships for the power they need. And so the public value, that's eroded completely. And I can see it every day, unfortunately. So, Gabe, you've got a question.
Oh, we've lost muted. Gabe. Yeah, he's muted. So if you unmute.
I do that in case it's noise.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it goes a little further than that. I mean, I've been watching with distress about how Biden just blocked Chinese EVs
Hmm.
and renewables coming into the United States. I mean, because if they could produce it cheaper, I mean, it makes any commitment on his part, seem like a joke,
Hmm.
and also, I mean, it distresses me that I don't see any climate organizations pushing back on that. But I think that's because of Big D is in the White House. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's kind of divided the climate space a bit. I saw Robinson Meyer from Heat Map, his article this week kind of makes, I think, a pretty compelling case that Biden's move on this with the tariffs is less about climate policy, which, I mean, I think if you're just concerned with climate policy, sure, a bunch of cheap Chinese solar panels and cheap EVs, just let it flood. Let all that cheap green energy stuff flood in the market and let's just get to work, right? But Biden has this theory of kind of building a political coalition via climate policy. And that is, they think, and I'm sympathetic to this, I'll say, they think that's going to be best achieved through a kind of industrial policy that does sort of reindustrialize the United States through investments in manufacturing. And to me, as a sort of more like labor-oriented, union-oriented person, I buy into this kind of argument that there's something special about manufacturing that does build working class power in a
Yeah.
standard way, and that so I'm sympathetic to this point of view. I'm not sure it's going to work. I'm not sure that we're going to actually be able to build cheap enough decarbonized technologies in the United States that would actually, given the kind of wage stagnation and the attack on the working class in our country for decades, like, are these people going to be able to afford these kind of tariff protected, high priced solar panels and EVs? Right now, EVs are just a privilege of the middle, or really the upper classes. I mean, most EVs. So like, there's some real challenges with this approach. But I will say, I think the idea of using climate policy to reindustrialize the United States and build a kind of working class coalition along those lines, because let's be clear, it's kind of these deindustrialized areas that have been shifting to the right and to Trump for the last decade, and this is happening in Europe, and sort of the right is sort of capitalizing on the abandonment of the industrial working class. So I see the theory there. It's going to be tough to pull off. And again, this kind of private sector oriented tax credit approach that Biden uses, I'm also really kind of skeptical that workers are really going to see that as a political kind of project, as opposed to, like, where I live in Syracuse, it's just like this company called Micron is coming to build chips, right? And people don't really think about it as a Biden thing. They think about it as Micron, right? A private company. So.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. So I am all over the EV tariff. Like I just got under the wire for a new electric bike before a 25% tariff increase. We're not sure if new shipments are for electric, smaller electric vehicles are going to be hit, but everyone is kind of scared. And so there's a lot of shipping containers that just arrived. They're getting to work, and I hope my order creeps in without any surprise charges. And this is going to cause consumer anxiety, sort of consumer stress when it comes to selecting an EV, balancing, what you're going to do. Are you going to keep using a used car? Are you going to buy a new gasoline vehicle? Or are you going to have to balance the questionable availability of American EVs, and so this is part of those political trade-offs that I think you're pointing at. That it's not a simple world. It's just not going to give us everything we want while we're maintaining this sort of consumer driven
Mhm.
climate progress. Soccer
Yeah,
moms and solar panels aren't going to do it.
exactly. And we've pursued, I would say, a consumer first kind of political economy for the last several decades. It's basically like globalization is going to allow production to go overseas where labor is cheaper and there's not much environmental regulation. And that has, I mean, it's hard to argue that has provided a lot of cheap material goods flowing into our country from China and elsewhere, right? And so, but that also has come alongside a concerted attack on the labor side of the economy, right? Not just in the U.S., but really you could say globally. And so, when you attack labor and lower wages, it can lead to cheap stuff for consumers. But that, as we've seen, that has cost in society as a whole, right? So I'm kind of geared up and maybe a little bit naively excited about the idea of trying to orient back toward a labor-centered type of policy that tries to empower unions and empower labor. And then through that, you hope that the workers actually can get high enough wages to buy perhaps not as cheap stuff that's flowing in as part of that arrangement.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's the next phase, which is with our labor, with our reindustrialization of America, we start to creep back. We start to get, lithium-ion battery factories. We start to get sort of the end components manufacturing that we have given up to China. And that's the long-term plan. Is Biden playing that like 5-dimensional long-term plan?
Yeah. I think the Robinson Meyer piece I mentioned, I think the image for it is literally a weird like cartoon graphic of Biden playing chess. And Meyer's point is that Biden has this kind of long-term theory of rebuilding a kind of coalition, a broad popular coalition along this kind of industrial policy scale. But he could lose in November, and that could, and Trump is also pursuing tariffs and also claims to want to bring industry back, but he's rather incompetent. It's very interesting. But yeah, I was gonna say, I think the prospect of this being a way to kind of empower unions and labor is sort of the thing that's what I was going to say, is that a lot of like people on the climate left just don't sort of know much about the work it takes to build these types of infrastructure. So they have this naive, vague idea that like, we're just going to do a just transition and coal workers are going to transition into renewables, right? But what that has meant in the United States is largely people working to build solar farms or wind farms, which are very precarious, temporary construction jobs that are not prone to kind of unionization. And if you look at the kind of the reporting about these jobs, they're terrible jobs. They're not union, and they're just not very conducive to organizing because they're all dispersed. But that being said, if we were to bring into this country the manufacturing of solar panels and wind turbines, like that actually, I think does, and EV factories, as you said, like those types of jobs do have the potential for organizing and rebuilding working class power. So there I see some path where, even if I know we're on an eco-modernist podcast, so we're all very pro-nuclear, right? But if there are going to be renewables involved, like the labor path for me is going to be in manufacturing of those renewables in factories, as opposed, I mean, the installation jobs I think are temporary and not great. One example I've used is in Texas, read this report where they did have 1,800 union jobs to construct a solar farm in Texas for the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. But once that solar farm is constructed, they estimated 2 permanent jobs. 2. So it's like these are not like nuclear plants where they lead to long-term, hundreds of people working in the same place day after day. These are temporary. These are temp jobs, right? So, but solar panel factory, EV factory, wind panel, these are good, could be good union jobs.
Right. That's yeah. And getting more experience in the nuclear industry, it's very clear that there is a wealth of talent out there. And if America is not capitalizing on that talent, we risk a second level of deindustrialization. We risk losing what little talent we have to other emerging economies. And we could miss the boat completely. Like, for example, Germany is looking off the edge of a cliff of complete deindustrialization, loss of not just their nuclear and their nuclear workforce, their construction workforce, their ability to build, but their academic incentive to work in nuclear now is completely gone. And so they're going to see, graduating engineers move out of their country. Their income potential is gone, it's lost. And it's a recipe for disaster. And I don't want to see that happen in America. So I do want to see, success on every front. I want to see us build the base load that'll build the solar panels, that'll build decarbonization.
Yeah,
that's why something like okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think it would be a good idea for the win-win if, just like they bring in Volkswagen to have their factories in America, that they bring in those Chinese factories. But that's probably heresy in the State Department right now.
Well, there is. I feel like I read a New York Times article about some sort of solar factory in, I believe, Ohio, where it is partially Chinese owned, and then there's this kind of Trump right-wing movement in their area, in the region, against the factory because it's China, and so there is some of that already happening. I think the one other thing I was going to say is that this is why, to me, like the sort of like slam dunk, like it should be totally obvious what a just transition would look like, which is taking coal plants that have already been shut down because they've been thrown out of business by cheap natural gas. Take these coal plants and recommission them for nuclear. They're already on the transmission system. They already have like skilled workers in the community that used to work at these power plants, and they can be trained to. So like that's such a slam dunk. But yet when you talk to a lot of climate people, they sort of have this idea of people in the coal plants will then go work in renewables, and there's no clear sort of skill transfer from coal plants to renewables, but there is an obvious way for coal plant workers to go into nuclear. And again, it just makes a lot of sense with the infrastructure. So
absolutely. Well, let's talk about this. We started talking about, the reindustrialization and our building up of the workforce. At the base level, at the very base level of all of this are the resources. And so what is your article, what makes resources political? What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, I hope I'm enjoying this more sort of practical, policy-oriented discussions. I hope this doesn't take us too far off the deep end theoretically, but it's a pretty theoretical review article that tries to argue that fundamentally sort of the political economy's kind of understanding of capitalism is actually something capitalism that is new historically, is it kind of separates the realm of politics from the realm of the economy, right? And we kind of act like there's this realm called the economy that's subject to these sort of abstract and impersonal markets. It's supposed to, in an ideal world, it's supposed to be kind of left relatively alone and left to its own naturalized supply and demand dynamics and competition. And then separate from that, you have a realm called politics, where you have governments and elections, and of course they intertwine. But in pre-capitalist historical formations, there wasn't this separation. The lords and feudalism were political dominators of society, and they oppressed the serfs economically. at the same time, right? There wasn't this kind of separation of the political and economic. And so what I try to argue in the piece is that there's ways through which our social relationship with natural resources and energy in particular can be seen as sort of shaping how in a capitalist society we conceive of the political realm, right? So one of those arguments I make is really my first book, Lifeblood, is about how really we need to think of energy as kind of the sort of material basis of all of society. And insofar as we created in the middle of the 20th century, particularly out of the crisis of the Great Depression, we kind of used public resources to create this sort of highly suburbanized way of living for working people, right? Kind of created all this public infrastructure for highways and all this public support of mortgages and suburban home ownership for generally white people. And we created this highly dispersed way of living. And I called it the kind of oil-fired privatism, right? We kind of allowed people to disperse, and they needed a lot of cheap liquid fuel to kind of disperse everyone throughout the.
Have I lost everything? Okay. Hey folks, we've got an outage on Zoom, unfortunately. And so I'm going to double check our broadcast. I'll be just a moment. I'm going to put us to commercial. Sorry for 1 second. Yeah, there's something going on with my Zoom.
I want to speak to you about a new organization called the Eco-Modernist Society of North America. I'm here because we are in the midst of a potentially monumental ecological crisis. It is only through a new environmentalism 2.0 that progress can be made. We believe that our only hope for human advancement and even human survival is through the exponential advance of science in the service of humanity. Eco-modernism is a new environmental paradigm which looks to reverse the fear of nuclear power and scientific progress in general. Ecology-based modernism is the most direct way to define it. Eco-modernism as a philosophy is described in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. We believe humanity should not be rejecting technological progress, but rather separating impacts from nature through the responsible use of technology and urbanization.
You're muted there,
Is an
Carl.
unstoppable worldwide trend and the best solution to many environmental problems.
Gabe, I'm not getting your camera. That's
offers
probably
sustainable
all right.
development for the human population and is a historic antidote to.
Okay, and we're back live. Just to let everyone know, I noticed everyone's screen freeze. We cut off in the middle of. I actually kind of like where it was going when we were getting just back to. Gabe's trying to call me now. He's disconnected. We were just getting back to how these two topics tied together. I heard you talk about what makes resources political, which has a more theoretical foundation. That new capitalism separates politics from our base economy. And coming back to that, like restoring that connection between where are our means of production, where's our national resources coming to, and how does that shape the lives and productivity of the people of the nation? Is that the solution? Is that from mandate, or is that through more careful policy? Where were you going with the reintegration of these connections?
So yeah, I was right in the middle of trying to tell the story of how we kind of used a lot of public investment to create a highly privatized way of living and population in the suburbs. And by the 1970s, that suburban block of a lot of them were workers, right? A lot of them became the kind of populist basis for what we now, I don't know if you call it, basically like free market ideology. Some people call it neoliberalism, which led to kind of the Reagan Revolution of 1980, Margaret Thatcher and all the rest, which was an attack on really the notion that we should politically intervene in the economy at all. So this sort of idea that the economy should be really apolitical and it should be just left to its own free market devices, and government should deregulate and the government should get out of the economy, that became sort of the hegemonic way of approaching the economy. And I try to argue again that there's this kind of energetic basis to this privatized populist bloc in the suburbs providing popular support for this idea, which is ironic given suburbia can't function without all this public support, right? And so then we live for decades under this sort of neoliberal approach where really we feel kind of powerless over the economy, over steering economic forces in ways that could benefit the mass of the population. And that has, I think, eviscerated a lot of the working class's economic security, because we've kind of underneath free markets is really just giving a lot more power to capital and capitalist class. And that as people's lives, as the middle class has been destroyed and people's lives have gotten worse, people are getting more angry, and you start to get this kind of populism, right, where you do get these kind of critiques of capitalism, whether it comes from Trump or which is, I would say, like a nationalist kind of anti-globalist critique of global capitalism, or you have the kind of Bernie Sanders wing that really tries to say, no, it's the rich and the billionaires who are screwing us all over. But you start to finally have a kind of politics that's really sort of critical of this neoliberal consensus that's ruled over us for several decades. And now I think we're in the, as Antonio Gramsci called, we're in this interregnum, this sort of middle period where it's not clear what direction we're going to go. We might go in this kind of green social democratic left direction, or we might go in this much more right-wing authoritarian populist direction. And things are kind of up for grabs politically, which, as someone that was born I was born in 1978, right before the Reagan Revolution, my whole life has been a period just where politics didn't feel like it was even possible that it was just sort of like both parties were sold off to the same kind of neoliberal ideals. So it is exciting, but it's also, I think, a very dangerous moment. But at least the idea that the government should be directing economic policy is finally sort of come back into vogue, and I think that's a good thing. So
great.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Gabe. I think we're all reconnected now, both virtually and conceptually. We're getting back in this interregnum towards the current election, because we've kind of got a choice. We've got this, reindustrializing, quote, middle of the road Democrat, and the long view of climate and industrial progress, or sort of the bumbling opportunist who thought he was going to clap his hands and reinvigorate American fossil fuels and nuclear at the same time by imposing a few tariffs and talking about how great American workers were, without actually helping foster the policies and the infrastructure we need to build out those industries.
Yeah.
You can take it from there.
Yeah, well, the question really is, I was one of the people that was kind of very excited by the idea of a Green New Deal, simply because I think in our country's history, the New Deal was really the period where we actually had a state that was being pushed from, below by labor struggle and strikes, but also kind of had a lot of like technocratic expertise, and kind of actually said, we're in a Great Depression, we're going to like use the power of the state to kind of rebuild the economy from the ground up. And but that was through kind of public led investment, things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which, by the way, is one of the few, a lot of capitalists aren't that interested in developing new nuclear. Some are, but this public utility is really gung-ho about developing new nuclear, and they're really excited about it. So that's kind of one of our lodestar things. But but that, the New Deal period was so much about the public sector sort of rebuilding core infrastructures, not just the electricity system, where TVA its slogan was electricity for all. It sounds like a Bernie Sanders slogan. It was basically, you know, private utilities they didn't see it as profitable to bring electricity to poor rural areas. And they were like, no, everyone deserves this service of electricity, and we're going to create institutions that make sure electricity gets to each and every farm in the country. And, in 1934, something like 10% of farms had electricity. By 1950, it was over 90%. So it was really about bringing the material benefits of electricity to the masses of people. And, but not just electricity, like they built schools, they built bridges, they built things like art and theater, like things like the Red Rocks Amphitheater in Denver. Like, these are New Deal projects. There's a great website called The Living New Deal that just catalogs all across the country, all these libraries, pools, all this lovely infrastructure that we still benefit from. And all that stuff was built with, like a political label on it, whether it be the Works Progress Administration or the Civil Works Administration. Like, it was clearly a political project to kind of rebuild, capitalism, but for the benefit of workers in rural areas. And you can see why, the Democratic Party the New Deal coalition created just a tremendously popular support for that kind of New Deal Democrats for decades after that. I think the Democrats had control of Congress for pretty much every year from the 30s through the 90s. There are some exceptions there, but so that to me is like this. We're kind of in a similar period where we need that kind of level of ambition, and I'm a bit just worried that again, the Biden approach to just sort of showering tax credits on the private sector, having the private sector do all the building. It's not that kind of scale of political project that really is going to build up that level of support and popular support, because again, people just see a lot of companies coming to their towns and they don't know it's like Bidenomics, or they don't know it's this sort of political effort to win over people. So we'll see. I mean, if he's given another 4 years, maybe he can kind of start to explore more of the public oriented side of things that, I don't think Biden's even, I think last time I checked, I'm not even sure he's even appointed new people to the TVA board, right? Like he's not really seemingly all that interested in the TVA and like the sort of more public sector led efforts at decarbonization. So that's kind of where I would hope we could go. And I think we had a chance to kind of go in that direction with Bernie Sanders, and we failed. And now we're kind of stuck with this more centrist private sector approach, right. And we'll see how it plays out.
And let me riff on that real quick. So the sort of the difference again being TVA versus BPA is we have one government administrator in my neck of the woods that is the backbone of the power trading, but doesn't really have much other than this base load of enormous hydro and a few, other base load services, like one nuclear reactor is it. And so it's on the back of this public good that we are conducting this wild energy trading market and pretending that it's going to just work out forever this way without continuing to invest in the infrastructure like you're advocating for with TVA, where TVA has the capital and the ability to build in its mandate, where out here we don't really. We have to go, beg 27 different PUDs to build our next reactor, and then we have to conduct public polling and voting to override some very old, very foolish laws that don't allow new nuclear. Oh man, I was gonna let Gabe go ahead with his question, but yeah, you have any? I mean, but yeah, it is Biden. So there is some public investment in the IRA, but you're saying the vast majority of this are credits for moving in to existing, in existing points of need. And because it's not government directed, we don't get the visibility. We don't get the credit for that investment. We just get,
exactly.
Micron is saving Syracuse,
Yes.
not Biden's tax credits brought Micron to save Syracuse.
Exactly.
Gabe.
Now
go ahead.
There is the Inflation Reduction Act does have a provision that's called direct pay, where public power entities can take these tax credits for the first time ever. So there is some excitement that might catalyze a huge boom in public power and public ownership of these types of projects. I'm a little skeptical. This tax credit market is very mature, and it has a lot of financiers and lawyers that are very sort of comfortable in figuring out how to channel these credits to tax burdened individuals. And so there's this already existing infrastructure that I think is sort of going to lock it in towards majority private sector. But at least there is the chance with the direct pay that we could see at least more public sector take up of these projects, but haven't seen much so far.
Great. Gabe, are you back? You want to ask your question?
He's kind of in and out, it looks like to me.
Maybe if you turn off your video, it'll work better. Sorry, Gabe.
Yeah. No. Okay. This is a technical question, though. I know my internet connection is bad just because where I am. Is that messing with your internet?
Not at the moment. There's a very small chance it did, but
does it? Okay.
We just lose you, and you're probably delayed a bit, unfortunately.
Yeah. I'm going to come out. I noticed where everything is coming through on your end good, because I'm looking at everything is mashed up on web.
Yeah, we're having a good broadcast here.
Everything's good. Okay, it's just fine. That's all I wanted to know.
Okay, that's your question.
That's all I wanted to add.
Okay.
Yeah, that is.
Well, great, awesome. No,
to make sure everything's going good.
Okay. Yeah, and your audio continues to break up a little bit. So I'm going to transition us to sort of the next question we had prepared. We've previously spoken to Dr. Shimon Michał, who wrote this paper on for the Geological Survey of Finland on the lack of availability of critical raw materials, and these materials really help ameliorate some of the resource constraints in fighting climate change. Previously, I've just recently been to Thorium Energy Alliance conference, and we had a number of addresses where the Chinese strategy for restricting the trade of these materials is part of their national strategy to continue to solidify their manufacturing. Is that something that we're going to be able to take a hold of in America? Where you think we need to go with these critical elements and transitioning to more clean energy?
Well, there's, the standard eco-modernist answer to that is the most materially efficient form of energy is obviously nuclear, right? A lot of all the sort of hullabaloo around critical materials is this idea that we're going to have like a 80% solar and wind grid, which that would require a heck of a lot of materials, right? And minerals, and not to mention the batteries and all that. So, but nuclear requires a lot less, and there's good, thinking of Seaver Wang has good research on that. So, but I would say, as I'm not an expert on these particular critical minerals, whether it be lithium or whatever else, I will say that I'm a scholar of oil, and oil to me is one of those minerals or things that you mine out of the ground that for really now over a century, geologists and other people have been warning that we're just about to run out of oil any minute now. And I did my dissertation on oil during the latest round of peak oil mania and concern about hitting peak oil. But what I've noticed from that history is that basically the capital is very good at finding oil when the price goes up. And when the price goes up, it becomes way more profitable to extract oil. And lo and behold, they find more oil, and whether it be fracking or offshore. So I've seen kind of a similar kind of narrative. I would call it like kind of like a Chicken Little narrative about critical minerals, and like, you know, looming scarcity of lithium or this or that. But I would say my sort of inclination is to think that those can be overblown, and that generally capitalists are pretty good at finding this stuff if there's a price incentive to do so. But that said, again, I'm from a socialist planning perspective, I would say we want to plan a rational energy transition that uses the least amount of minerals and materials possible. And if you're into that, then you should go with nuclear power. So
I have no argument there. I know that nuclear is absolutely capable of doing it. There's a lot of people that really want us to build everything, and I'm saying, yeah, that's great. And the only problem that I'm seeing is that China is solidifying their monopoly as the producer of photovoltaic silicon. They're enshrining their monopoly as the manufacturing powerhouse. And so, yeah, nuclear would be great. I want to see, I want to see a million. I want to see 100 nuclear plants go up by 2050, at least. But if we don't start today, if we don't start moving as quickly as possible, I do see sort of the cooperation, and that cooperation will either feature America's contribution and contribution of American workers, or it's going to leave us behind.
For sure.
So where does that bring us with the climate movement? You've criticized sort of the climate movement's unwillingness to acknowledge that the just transition isn't materializing. Where do we go next with the climate movement to rebuild the base?
So my book tries to argue that the climate movement is too embedded in what I call the professional class. That essentially, when you look at the climate movement, it's mostly highly educated, journalists or academics like me or scientists, and that generally that kind of class position leads to a kind of climate politics that I argue is uniquely sort of bad at sort of appealing to the mass of particularly the working class, the sort of larger majority of society. In a country like the United States, close to 2/3 of the population doesn't have a college degree. They're not in this professional educated class. And so finding ways to make climate politics appeal to that larger majority is really lacking. And I argue that, like climate politics, I basically, I say the professional class versions of it come in sort of three forms. The first I call the science communicators, who believe that like we're going to solve climate change by just spreading the truth of climate science, and they really make the politics all about, do you believe or deny the science, and the deniers are bad. And you can think about like the March for Science as being during the Trump years, that's kind of a mass action of this kind of style of politics. But I would argue it's a very naive theory of change in politics. This idea if people just knew the truth, then politicians in the world would just sort of follow the truth and knowledge. But again, I see this as a much more as a power struggle over really powerful actors, and we're not going to win that struggle just by having the facts, right? The second types of professional class climate politics I talk about are the policy technocrats, who are people that might work in academia or think tanks, but that got really entranced by this idea that we're going to solve climate change with a very technocratic policy fix like carbon pricing, right? And they had this idea that, particularly in the neoliberal context we talked about earlier, that we can actually use the market to solve the climate crisis through the price mechanism, right? If we just get the prices right and we put a tax on carbon and we kind of channel markets, then we'll solve it. And they had this, I think, kind of delusional idea too, that because it's a free market, policy, we can appeal to the right. And I focus on this group, and I hope none of your listeners are offended or members, but the Citizens Climate Lobby, who really put this carbon fee and dividend sort of their flagship policy. And they had this idea that they were going to make it revenue neutral so that the fee would actually not lead to the growth of government. And they thought they were going to win over Republicans with this policy. And of course, the right is just never going to be won over on this climate issue. But they, to me, epitomize this kind of professional class approach to climate politics. They have a slogan that said, "We're going to outsmart climate change." That's, to me, like really smart, educated people think they can just be smarter than the opposition and win over with their smarts. The third kind is the one I'm most familiar with, which I call the anti-system radicals, which are, again, highly educated, usually people in academia, but they are sort of radical, degrowth type people, eco-socialist type people who have this kind of really sort of, I argue that because they're professional class, they're sort of trapped in a very materially affluent kind of lifestyle. And so therefore, they kind of think the real cause of all the climate process or breakdown is like overconsumption and kind of consumerism and middle class consumption. So they kind of often aim their critiques on people consuming too much and consumption. And again, it appeals to them because they sort of are surrounded by this middle class excess. But again, for the vast majority of people under neoliberalism, it's been wage stagnation, debt, and kind of economic insecurity that's defined most people's lives. And so this idea of critiquing, you consume too much does not have much mass appeal. The other thing that degrowthers and anarchists and other kind of, they think that like, they're very anti-industrial. They're just sort of like, we're going to build like little micro experiments and small scale local agriculture or bike sharing or gardens or in small scale kind of alternatives to industrial society. And this sort of, again, quite naive idea that these little small scale alternatives to capitalism and the cracks of capitalism will kind of by evolution just sort of spread throughout society. And that, again, most people, I think that's not really appealing to most people to be like part of a commune or a small farm or something like that. And so, so all three of these really come across as kind of antagonistic to the larger majority of society and the working class. And again, as I said earlier, a lot of the sort of legacy of deindustrialization, a lot of the industrial working class has been shifting more to the right. And so the climate movement itself is kind of trapped in this minority of society in the professional class. It has not been able to kind of build a movement that can kind of like appeal to the mass workers of society. And so that's its problem. And then the whole other part of the problem too is that, to me, decarbonization and climate progress is really all about building entirely new infrastructure. And again, who's going to build all this new transmission lines, all new public transit, all this new infrastructure is going to be built by construction workers and building trades unions and people that are in those sectors of the economy, which are this kind of bit more manual workers and builders. But again, that the climate movement is not them. Right? It's always knowledge workers and people that work with their heads and not their hands. And so there's this real kind of class divide between the climate movement and the actual workers and people we need to build the energy transition. And unfortunately, that divide sometimes becomes a pretty hostile antagonism. So you have a lot of the unions and the workers in those sectors, they don't have good feelings about the climate movement or the climate politics. I always tell this story. I was in Denmark, a social democratic country, and I was hanging out with a lot of climate activists who had read my book, which was nice. But they were all kind of very cosmopolitan, urban folks. They biked around and they talked a lot about degrowth and solidarity with the global South and indigenous people and all this kind of, they had all the lingo down. But when I was there, they had an election that had just gone very poorly for the left, and the right had made huge gains. And there was reporting in Jacobin that showed that the right had won over a lot of the industrial workers in the wind sector. So, Denmark is known for the wind energy, right? And these are, again, wind workers are, again, very different from these kind of professional knowledge workers. And so the point I'm trying to make is, like, if you can't even win over the wind workers, how are you going to build kind of a large climate coalition, right? And so that's sort of a striking evidence of these, somewhat cultural divides between different types of workers, but a real problem where all the climate movement is sort of on one side of that divide.
Yeah. And we even see, fights between those of us in the climate movement. We see I remember the promise of a revenue neutral carbon tax was centered in the climate movement in Seattle around 2014, 2015. And it lost
Exactly,
because the anti-system radicals won the conversation. They required, more inclusive prescription of how the funds were going to be spent. A sales tax cut was not good enough, even though that is our most regressive tax. It wasn't good enough. And instead, we now have the anti-system version that was sort of promoted ever since then. It was based on this coalition of interests, and that language flowed into the legislature, who, even though after the last time this initiative failed, the legislator did it themselves. And now we have an enormous fund that's from our fuel and carbon tax, and everyone is fighting over it. Everyone's fighting over where these funds are going to be spent. And I'm not seeing on the board of a, mass transit advocacy group, we're not seeing it going towards mass transit. We're not seeing it going towards electrification and, infrastructure. We're not seeing it being reinvested. It's being siphoned away from our progress.
Yikes. Yeah, it failed. I use this example a lot. It failed twice. It failed in 2016 and 2018. And the 2018 version did have a lot of the more sort of anti-system radical folks, like the environmental justice folks, were part of that coalition. So there was a lot of optimism on the left that they are doing it right this time. But when it comes down to it, when you're going to talk to most ordinary people, do you want to vote yes or no on something called a carbon fee or tax? People are going to say that sounds bad, right?
Oh, well, I want to go with any final thoughts you have. What's your next project? I saw you on the Odd Lots. Any other great podcasts you want to talk about appearing on?
Let's see. No, the Odd Lots one was good. I just published something with my collaborator Fred Stafford in Damage magazine called The Utility of Utilities, which, again, speaking of the kind of professional class climate left, if there's one villain of the climate left that's not the fossil fuel industry, it's sort of utilities, right? Electric utilities are kind of seen as the big problem in blocking a lot of decarbonization. But we tried it in the essay, and by the way, the essay is in a journal called Damage magazine, which has got a lot of really great stuff, particularly for people trying to reinvigorate this kind of more industrial union part of the left. We try to argue that, utilities is a very good idea. Public utility law came out of a history of progressive legal scholars who really thought, there's these parts of the economy that are so, like, they call them essential services, like water and like gas and even railroads, that are not really best run by a sort of market and just pure private capitalism, that they should be heavily regulated. And in many cases, there are things called natural monopolies, where it just makes sense to have one entity that manages this infrastructure. And in the US, that did lead to public utility systems where we did give electric utilities in some cases to private investor-owned utilities, but they were still heavily regulated by the public utility commissions. And in the post-World War II era, where we had this need for growth of electricity throughout society, they were pretty good at building infrastructure, because they profit off of infrastructure. Most capitalists just profit off squeezing labor and underselling competition, but utilities profit off building stuff. That's how they get their investments approved as by commissions, as saying that we need this infrastructure for the electric system, and therefore we charge higher rates on consumers to and so we're now in a period, we've had kind of like grid stagnation and demand stagnation for many decades, but we're in a period now with decarbonization and artificial intelligence and data centers where we're entering a new period of what's called load growth, where we're going to need a massive growth. And we try to make the case that, like, if you want a lot of growth, like this sort of scattered independent power producers competing on wholesale markets is not a really good model for growth. But utilities are, and we try to make a more sort of perhaps somewhat nostalgic argument that we should reclaim this idea of public utilities, that electricity should be considered a public utility. And I would prefer that we go back to it being vertically integrated, where you actually have it sort of, again, if you're interested in planning, much more easier to plan electricity when you have one entity that controls generation, transmission, and distribution. So any event, that's the latest article we've written, and I definitely think eco-modernist listeners would enjoy it. So
I definitely agree. It's there in the chat, and it's there in the reply to the tweet that started our broadcast on Twitter. So check out the latest in Damage Magazine, The Utility of Utilities. This has been the Eco-Modernist Channel Live. You can find us here every 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, right here on x.com/CarlAlexPauls, also on the Eco-Modernist channel on YouTube, also at the Eco-Modernist Society of North America on Facebook, on twitch.tv/Soyaddle, soyaddle.tv, other places like Kick, and oh, by the way, we do have a Patreon. So you can support us in the work we do here at patreon.com. Look for the Eco-Modernist channel there, and as well at our website, ESNA.earth. Now, that's it for the program today, so I'm going to find a channel for everyone here on Twitch to go enjoy. And remember, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
I want to speak to you about a new organization called the Eco-Modernist Society of North America. I'm here because we are in the midst of a potentially monumental ecological crisis. It is only through a new environmentalism 2.0 that progress can be made. We believe that our only hope for human advancement and even human survival is through the exponential advance of science in the service of humanity. Eco-modernism is a new environmental paradigm which looks to reverse the fear of nuclear power and scientific progress in general. Ecology-based modernism is the most direct way to define it. Eco-modernism as a philosophy is described in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. We believe humanity should not be rejecting technological progress, but rather separate our impacts from nature through the responsible use of technology and urbanization. Urbanization is an unstoppable worldwide trend and the best solution to many environmental problems. It offers sustainable development for the human population and is a historic antidote to both deforestation and species extinction as humans move away from using wildlife as their protein source. Vertical, urban, high-rise architecture minimizes the use of land, resources, and energy, enabling walkable cities that facilitates the more efficient use of mass public transit as well. It must be emphasized that our support for technological solutions is definitely not about defending industrial polluters, nor does our defense of technology imply that we just need to sit back and let things take care of themselves. To the contrary, we believe that humanity is at a crossroads that severely threatens our future on this planet. I hope by now you understand the worthiness of our cause. Eco-modernism is really only a philosophy at this time. I want to talk to you about the necessity of turning it into a movement, which will be part of the larger environmentalist movement. for it is only through our presence and participation that there can be any hope of moving environmentalism in the right direction. Our aim is not to divide the environmental movement, but rather to multiply its numbers with the incorporation of many scientific and educational communities that is working to both build chapters of eco-modernist societies and support our growth worldwide.